Welcome to week 4 of the Heart Sutra online class. This is week 4 out of 6. And I'd like to begin this week by talking a little bit about the path of practice in general, and then going to more specifics relating to the readings for this week, which you hopefully have seen on the class syllabus page. So oftentimes we hear about two different views of the path of practice. And one view is that you're on your own. That practice is work that you can only do for yourself. No one can do it for you. And that you need to be your own teacher or find your own way. And this kind of view often emphasizes the intentionality of practice, the aspirational aspect perhaps, and some perseverance. And however, it can also lead to a kind of arrogance and a kind of sense of isolation. Another view of the path of practice is that we're all in this together, that nothing can be done by oneself, and that good Dharma friends are the whole of the Dharma life, the practice life, and that there's no point in doing a lot of striving on your own, because it all has to happen with everybody. We're all in the same boat. This is beautiful. This is sometimes comes out of a kind of open-heartedness or a kind of surrender to causes and conditions. And yet it can also lead to a kind of longing and a kind of a loss of the sense of agency. So what's interesting about the path, I would suggest, one of the many interesting things, is that both of these two things are fully true. We tend, human beings, we tend to want to choose one side or the other. To emphasize the independent self, or to emphasize the communal self, the connected self. And yet, I would suggest that the path of practice really requires both of these two ways of practicing. It really asks us to see them both as important ways of understanding ourselves as practitioners. And even so, one step further, I would suggest that the path also asks us to fully transcend both of those views. It asks us to begin to see the world in a way that is not based in ways of defining self and other, whether in relationship or independently. And this is where we start to become engaged at this point in the Heart Sutra. So we're at the point in our study where the many of the major frameworks of early Buddhism are being mentioned. And so rather than read Thich Nhat Hanh's translation, which is the one that I'm primarily going to refer to today, I want to just read from a different one. So, for example, the San Francisco Zen Center translation says, therefore, given emptiness, there is no form, no sensation, no perception, no formation, no consciousness. So no to the five skandhas or khandhas, no eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind. So no six sense organs, six sense faculties. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, object of mind, so no objects of sense organs. Realm of sight or realm of mind consciousness, so that's referring to the consciousnesses which go with each of the sense faculties. And I want to suggest, similar to what we did with our study of the Diamond Sutra, for a few of you who were involved in that class as well, I want to suggest that we substitute this word no for empty. And rather than seeing it as a negation, which is a way that many commentators have looked at it, and that's certainly one way, I would propose that more interesting from our perspective is to have a look at this as a text that's saying form, sensation, perception, etc. are empty. Ears, eyes, nose, tongue, mind, empty. Objects that we see, visual objects, auditory objects, gustatory objects, I think is what they're called for taste, olfactory objects, touch objects, solid things, or mental objects also empty, so conditional, right? Based on causes and conditions, only appearing, temporarily appearing, due to causes and conditions. And then there is this statement, neither ignorance nor extinction of ignorance, neither old age and death nor extinction of old age and death. So that is a reference to the first of the 12-fold chain of causation, or paticca-samuppada, or what's also called interdependent origination. And that's where we're going to spend a fair amount of our time today. But just to have a look at Thich Nhat Hanh's translation, to put this in context, this exchanging no for empty, what he says is, and the page is one of the gray pages at the beginning of the text, our text, where the full translation is given. The 18 realms of phenomena, which are the 6 sense organs, the 6 sense objects, and the 6 consciousnesses, are also not separate self-entities, non-separate, therefore conditional and interconnected, interbeing, as he likes to say. The 12 links of interdependent arising and their extinction are also not separate self-entities. So I want to have say a few words about that. What are the 12 links and what do they mean? How to practice with those? But before that, I just want to repeat that this teaching of interdependent co-arising does not presume a self. That's one of the most important aspects of this teaching. And it's one way that we can begin to understand the process of a human life and the way in which suffering or dukkha or stress or dissatisfaction arises without positing a separate self. And in fact, one of the reasons to really study this piece is because the Buddha himself is reported to have said that one who sees dependent arising sees the Dhamma, sees truth, sees reality, sees the teaching. And one who sees the Dhamma sees dependent arising. And when he tells the story of his own awakening, he says that this process of dependent arising was immediately preceded his enlightenment. It was his understanding of this process, which he describes as very subtle and very difficult to understand. His awakening was awakening to that. That's one of the tevijja, so to say, the three knowledges to which he awoke. So one was all of his karmic past, and in general, the karmic causes and conditions of all humankind, and the cycle of dependent arising. And those three things are related, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But it's for these reasons, and for reasons that we'll see, hopefully in some examples about how you can see this in your everyday life, is a very, very important topic in Buddhism. And we can take this teaching, the teaching of interdependent arising, as an abstract principle and understand it in a very, I would say, broad way, and in a way that transcends one human life. It actually looks out over the course of 3 or more human lives. And we can take it as a principle that we see in everyday life in terms of various thought moments, moment by moment, within a single human life. And finally, we can actually apply it very directly to the question of dukkha, to the question of how suffering or dissatisfaction, fundamental dissatisfaction, occurs in our life, and how we can begin to see the causes and conditions that relate to that and begin to work with that. So let me bring up the image that will help to describe this a bit better. So here we have a very, very simple picture of the cycle of Paticcasamuppada. And Paticcasamuppada is the Pali for this teaching. Paticca means dependent on, or it means because of, or conditioned by, caused by. And Samuppada is two-part word, and upada is the arising or the origination. And Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's a very well-respected translator and teacher, says this sam in this case implies a kind of complexity or a kind of co-origination, co-arising. So we can understand this to mean interdependent arising or codependent or interdependent origination. Those are various ways of talking about this particular cycle that we have here. And it's also, in a way, as I spoke about earlier, it's a particular type of emptiness. It's a particular type of conditionality that we can trace in a human life, in a series of human lives that are related to one particular set of karmic conditions. So it's also a very understood to be sort of the dynamic way of speaking about non-self or of speaking about emptiness. So let's look at the various parts there. We have them on the screen. So usually ignorance is understood to be the beginning. That's how the Buddha spoke about it. And as the graphic there says, is a kind of blindness. That's the way the Buddha spoke about it as well. It's a kind of blindness to the nature of existence, the nature of how our particular thoughts and words and actions result in the world that we experience. So literally unwise, avijja. Vijja is wisdom or knowledge, and is the negation of that. So ignorance is the beginning of the cycle. And because of ignorance, because we don't understand how things really work, then there are the sankhara. These are the mental formations. We spoke about them as one of the 5 khandhas, sankhara. This kind of sankhara, some commentators understand this kind of sankhara to mean all conditioned things, not just mental sankhara or formations. But things that are fabricated or things that are constructed is another way to think about it. Come together, put together is the literal meaning of that. And so from those mental formations, then consciousness arises. This is an interesting, so oftentimes there is the question, if there is no self, then what is it that is reborn? What is it that is taking shape as a body and mind after the death of this one? And that's what this is saying. This is saying that the results of the mental formations, the volitional thoughts, words, and deeds express themselves as the arising of a consciousness, and a consciousness which is also related to, attached to the next one, namarupa, name and form, or mind and body. And mind and body develops, emerges with the 6 sense organs. And salayatana are also including their objects there, the things that they relate to. And when that happens, so again, taking this from just a sequential view for just a moment, when that happens, then when the sense organ comes together with its object, and there is a consciousness of that, an awareness that can capture that and create a consciousness of that, then there is this thing called phassa, contact. And from contact, then we have the other 4 skandhas. So again, we've talked about this a little bit. And so we're kind of, it's that sometimes when I think about how to see this circle, it's kind of skipping a rock across a pond. It's like we're touching on certain parts of the cycle, and we're seeing how they're related. But they're actually talking, the cycle is itself mentioning some of the same factors 3 different times. So in any event, the contact happens, and then there's a Vedana, there's a feeling tone, there's a sensation, a sense of pleasure, pain, or indeterminateness of the contact itself. And from that, there is craving, tanha, craving or sometimes also translated as desire. So we're here in the circle now. And craving can be both for wholesome things and unwholesome things. And craving typically, there are 3 different kinds of craving that are typically expressed. There's craving for existence, there's craving for non-existence, and there is craving, I'm just trying to look it up here in the article so I can point you to the page of the article by Bhante Piyadasa, page 12, and there's craving for sense pleasures. And so there's a kind of feeling tone that arises, and if it's pleasant, then there is this reaching out toward it. There is this wanting that starts to happen. And when the wanting gets stronger, that becomes clinging or attachment. And then from the upadana, from the clinging, there's this becoming, or sometimes Bhikkhu Buddha translates it as existence, the playing out of the consequences of these things. The karmic vipaka actually is this becoming. And then that gives rise to birth, whether it's the birth of a new moment of contact or attachment, whether it's the birth of an actual being coming in to the womb. And then jara marana, so aging and death, all things which are born, all beings that are born must experience aging and death. And after aging and death, then there's this linking back to the ignorance, the unknowing, the blindness, taking its form as mental formations and the development of kama. So it's here in the sankhara where kama actually happens, where it develops. And if we look at this from the standpoint of 3 lifetimes, so let's some of you may or have doubts or be outright non-believing about rebirth, and that's certainly all right. It seems like the Buddha was very clear in his mind that there was rebirth, and he taught about that in this process. But I'll talk in a moment about how we can also see it without a belief in the rebirth process. But for now, to say this connection here between the formations, the volitional formations, that is the kama, because we know that anything which is done with intention, with volition, whether it be action or thought or speech, creates a kamic impulse, creates a kamic stream, if you will, or a particle that eventually results in vipaka, in the result. So it's here between those formations and consciousness that it's said that the first birth is arising, or that the life, if we look at one lifetime, this one lifetime can be seen to begin here at the beginning of consciousness and the formation of a body, and then that body experiencing the world through contact and having various feeling tones arise around that contact, and then craving them, wanting them. And it's this going after, constantly chasing after the pleasant Vedana that leads to stronger and stronger clinging of things which by their nature are going away, of things which by their nature we know must be fleeting. And so even though there is this becoming, then it must eventually end and take a new birth, so that the results of that, the energy of that, takes a new birth, and then new birth continues on into aging and death, and through the ignorance, the effects of ignorance, then again there's volition. So this is the past life. Ignorance and formations would be the past life, and those conditions are creating this set of consequences of the current life until the becoming. And then once the becoming has sort of expressed itself as much as it can in this lifetime, then it ends and goes into the third birth and aging and death again. So that's one way to look at it from the standpoint of 3 lifetimes. And so a couple of things there, just to say. So the beginning of the cycle is ignorance, or this kind of blindness. And typically it's understood to be also a blindness to, not in general the way this cycle, actually, a blindness to this way that things work, and often more specifically to the Four Noble Truths. And why? Because the second of the Noble Truths is craving. So the first Noble Truth is there is dukkha. There is dukkha in a human life. And the second Noble Truth is the cause of dukkha is this, tanha, craving. So the lack of understanding of craving, or tanha, is what drives this process. The ignorance is that lack of understanding, and then this craving arises and plays itself out, and then again you have the ignorance. So those two links are said to be the two places in which we as practitioners can actually impact the chain, can actually begin to bring an end to this chain. So why these two? Again, to see the workings of how we are constantly pulled by our desire for pleasant Vedana is to begin to understand something about the source of dukkha, the source of becoming, actually, and this playing out of karmic consequences, whether positive karmic consequences or negative karmic consequences. Both are included in this circle. And then ignorance. So the opposite of ignorance is insight. When we practice and begin to have insights into the workings of body and mind, the way that all things are in reality, the meaning of the 5 skandhas, then we are not so caught in this chain. We can actually begin to see the ways in which we have been driving this chain. And then we can begin to undo it. So the Buddha also spoke about the cessation. When there is, when ignorance ceases, then formations cease. And when formations cease, then consciousness ceases, and so on. So sometimes people talk about the chain going forward and the chain going backward, but actually there is not a chain going backward. It's the 12-fold chain of causation. Going forward is this cycle of birth after birth, creation after creation. Or there is, the way the Buddha described it, the chain not arising because of the cessation of ignorance. Or if we begin with the cessation of craving, again, how does craving cease? It ceases by understanding and the nature of Vedana and the nature of this life, the nature of these interconnections, and then not being caught up in that. So those are the two areas where we can make a difference, where we can begin to intervene, if you will, in the cycle. So another way to think about it, and so let me just give an example of something more near term, something more immediate perhaps, in terms of how we might see this cycle arising. So if you are unclear, if you're confused about cause and effect, and you get caught up, so that would be ignorance, and you get caught up in a volitional formation. So let's say you wake up in the morning and you decide, I would like to have pancakes for breakfast today. And so great, that's your volitional formation. It could be wholesome or unwholesome, difficult to determine at that point. I suppose if you're diabetic, it's probably unwholesome. If you're not diabetic and not gluten-free, or you find some gluten-free pancakes if you're gluten-free, if it's not harmful to you, it's possible that it could be a wholesome desire. Typically, however, wholesome and unwholesome would be related to what moves you forward on the spiritual path, what makes it possible for you to continue to practice awakening. So I'm not going to make any judgments about your pancakes, but in any event, so you wake up, you want to have some pancakes, that's your volitional formation. And where is it happening? There's some consciousness of that thought, and there is that actually happening in the material world, in the body. There's some activity that we experience in the body that supports that, and in the six sense spaces. So certainly there is an idea that is experienced by mind. So that's mind and its object. And there's an awareness of that idea. So you notice that idea enough to think that actually you might act on it. And then contact happens. So and then the six sense spaces get involved. So you maybe go to the pancake store and the six sense spaces get involved, and you experience the smell of pancakes or the taste of pancakes, or even you might just think about the smell or the taste of pancakes in that moment of wanting them. But some kind of contact happens, and then you have a feeling about that. Probably a very pleasurable feeling about pancakes. And here's where the cycle starts. That feeling, that positive feeling, makes you think, whether at that moment or perhaps some point in the future, but let's say for the sake of discussion, for the sake of this example, at that moment, yeah, I would like to have more pancakes. More pancakes are great. I like them. They're yummy. And so that's craving. That's going after, instead of allowing that pleasurable experience to be there when it's there and be gone when it's gone, there's a going after it. There's a pursuing it. There's a clinging to it. And that clinging can take the form of eating more pancakes right away. It could take the form of, I'm a person who likes pancakes, and taking a stand on that. It could take many different forms. But that's where you get the clinging. So clinging, there are typically 4 kinds of clinging that are said to happen, to arise. Clinging to sense pleasure being one of them. Clinging to views like that, the view that I'm a person that likes pancakes. Clinging to rituals and different kinds of spirituality or different kinds of belief systems. Activities following on those belief systems, so views and the activities that might express those views. And clinging to a self. I am a person who likes pancakes, who eats pancakes. You can't stop me from being a person who eats pancakes. So there's the clinging. And then the existence or the becoming is living with that. So then the body does some processing and those kinds of things. And then there is the birth of the next moment, birth of the next desire, the next thought. Maybe you order some more pancakes, and maybe you eat so many pancakes that you get sick. But the birth of the next moment is this sort of hangover, if you will, from the pleasant sensation and the pursuit of that pleasant sensation. And so it also plays itself out, and there's aging and death. So whatever happens there, the body continues to process the food. You continue to have this desire, this attachment, this identification with being a pancake eater. And there's some ignorance about that. There's some misunderstanding, some fundamental misunderstanding about that idea of needing to reach out for that or wanting to reach out for that, that leads to the cycle happening again. So in the case of pancakes, I would say, you know, unless you eat so many that it makes you sick, it's a fairly harmless situation. But this cycle of craving and clinging is the source of all of the greed that we see in the world. You know, 3 of our pieces this week mentioned climate change, and climate change happening specifically because of uncontrolled greed, of this very cycle of more and more and more and more, blind to the consequences, blind to the results of those actions. I would say also that wars are fought over this. The clinging to and identifying with and craving things, whether it be land or the Holocaust, for example, was a craving for a kind of purity in society. It was a craving and a clinging to a view of self and other that became so extreme that it resulted in the deaths of millions of people. This cycle plays itself out in many, many ways, subtle and gross. And so the understanding of this is really, really powerful. It has a tremendous impact on our perception of ourselves and our perception of the world, on the understanding of how we have a choice and how our choices make a difference in each and every moment and lifetime after lifetime. So it's a very, very intricate teaching. This is just kind of giving you the very basics of it. But I want to say also that what's really interesting, part of what's really interesting about the Buddhist teaching here is that he's not saying that things happen by chance, as we have touched on before in the class. The Buddha's not saying that life is random. Some people have that view. I myself had some of that view in my past. But he's not saying that. that life happens by chance, or that birth and death happen by chance, or that suffering happens by chance, or that it is intractable. And he's also not saying that it happens because of a God or because of a creator being. The Buddha allowed for creator beings. He spoke about them, but he spoke about them by saying they too are subject to this kind of dynamic. They too are subject to karma and rebirth. So one way of working with this in terms of everyday life is to ask ourselves, does this particular view, does this particular wanting or not wanting really result in peace of mind? Or does it really result in suffering, in fundamental dissatisfaction, in angst, in anxiety, in stress? Is this thing that I'm holding on to, whether it's a view or a person or a place or a ritual or a food or a beverage, does this thing that I'm clinging to, that I'm craving, that I'm identified with, does it cause more pain in my life? And then the second question is it mine? Is it me? Does it define me? Does it belong to me? And if the answer to those two questions, if the answer to the first question is yes, it's causing more suffering, and no, it's not mine or me or defining me, then the final question has to be, why hold on? Why keep at it? Why continue with the craving and the clinging and the going through this cycle again and again? Sometimes I relate this phenomena to rope burn. Maybe you've experienced this if you are into sailing, or if you played tug of war as a kid or as an adult. But if there's a rope that you're holding on to, and it's actually passing through your hands, as all things are passing through our hands in our life, and you cling to it, the more tightly you cling to it, the more pain you're going to experience. It actually will harm you. It will actually do damage. But if the rope is passing through your hand and you are able to loosen your grip on it, then it can't harm you. You can't get rope burn if you're not holding on. So let it be there when it's there, and let it be gone when it's gone. This is really important teaching. Really, really important teaching. And it's related to the Paticcasamuppada also. So looking at our reading from the island, so I gave you a link to the download for this text. And we'll talk more about Nibbana or Nirvana in the next class. But this week's reading was related to conditionality and to Paticcasamuppada. And so on page 56, we see these 4 statements by the Buddha related to interdependent arising. When this is, that is. And when this isn't, that isn't. So those two go together. And that is a kind of simultaneity. So the example that's used in the book, which I really appreciated, of a kind of simultaneously or in the moment now understanding these two, is one's shadow. So when there's light and there's a physical form, or the shadow of anything actually, not even one's body, but they use the body as an example. when there's light and there's a physical form, then simultaneously there's a shadow. There's no gap in time. That if there is this set of conditions, these two conditions, then that third condition is also present. That's a moment now, slice of time view. And it is empty, right? So those three things are inter-arising. They're inter-being. You cannot have one, you cannot have the shadow without the light and the physical form. So that's two of the statements. And then the other two statements, from the arising of this comes the arising of that, and from the stopping of this comes the stopping of that. So that's more of the process view, right? So we've talked also about the process view. So there is a kind of sequentiality to conditions oftentimes. And so you plant an apple seed, and from an apple seed, an apple tree grows. It's not random. You don't get an oak tree or a mango tree from an apple seed. You get an apple tree if the proper causes and conditions are present for that. But what's in the potential that's in the apple seed is apple tree. So when this is there and there's enough of the right conditions, then you get the consequent result. And if it's not there, so maybe you have the seed, but you don't have enough water or enough earth or enough sunlight, then the seed dies. So the potential was there for a certain result, but the conditions were not there. And therefore, from the stopping of this, from the lack of this, there is not that. So it seems very simple and very obvious, and yet it is a dynamic that we often ignore. It's a dynamic that we are often confused about. So this also points us at the fact that even when we talk about living in the moment now, living in the present, that present cannot be ignorant of the things that came before and the potential for things that come after. So sometimes people misunderstand that as well. And I remember somebody asking me a question, well, if I live in the moment now, then I just keep smoking. But that is to turn away from the reality of the causes and conditions that are being set in motion by the activity of the moment now. So Buddhism isn't asking us to be completely ignorant to both to a sequential view or to a momentary view. It's saying you need to be able to hold both, actually. You need to be able to see that both things are true, that we have the capacity actually to impact the future, to reflect on the past, and to act right now, and think and speak right now. And to begin to investigate how the ways that we act and speak and think right now can lead us to freedom from this dynamic, can lead us to being unhooked by this dynamic, not chasing after the pleasant Vedana over and over and over again for eons. So that's part of our reading for this week, and you'll have maybe a chance to speak about it a little bit more at Tuesday's session. And our reading ended at 58, but you may also notice that on page 59 and 60 and top of 61 is the detailed exposition of Paticcasamuppada by the Buddha. So where the particular sutta from which that image, that teaching that I was just going over, the 12-foot chain, arose. So that is a couple of things that I wanted to say about that. Okay, and also just to say, oftentimes this ignorance or this blindness or this arising of craving is not intentional. I would say in most folks, at most times, it's not intentional. People don't typically sit down and say, gee, I really want to start focusing on something that's going to create a lot of anxiety for me. Or I am determined to become addicted to a substance today, or this month, or this year, by pursuing my clinging and craving to a particular feeling. That usually doesn't happen. What happens is that we latch onto a sense perception. So going back to the pancake example, we latch onto the feeling, the positive feeling of eating pancakes. And then if we pursue it long enough and hard enough and too many times, many times, then we actually see that it's no longer pleasant. But there's a gap in time between when it actually stops being pleasant and when we see that, usually. You see what I'm saying? So at the beginning, maybe the first batch of pancakes was pleasant, but by the third or fourth batch of pancakes, it's not pleasant anymore, but you're maybe still thinking that it's pleasant. And so you might keep ordering more and more pancakes. And it's not until the 8th batch or so that you start to really realize, like, I'm feeling very sick and this is really harmful. So between that first batch and that 8th batch, there were a lot of choice points, which perhaps didn't recognize. Or to use another example, I really appreciated this example. I was listening to a talk by Ajahn Sucitto recently, and he used this example of, this person is always late. So we think that we know by virtue of our experience with someone what things are like, how things are going to be, and how to relate to them. So this person, you show up at the appointed time and that person isn't there. And you think, this person is always late. It happens over and over again. And so again, there can be two kind of extreme responses to that. There can be the response of, well, you know, that's the way the world is, and there's really nothing that can be done about it, and you know, you can't control other people, and you just kind of throw up your hands. Or there is the other way of looking at it, another way of looking at it, which is, no, we got to fix this. We got to get it right. You know, it's not optimal, and we need to optimize. And this person really needs to understand that that's not okay. And you know, we got to fix it. We got to get it right. And that's one standpoint that some folks have about the whole world, about their whole life, optimizing. And I would say ultimately neither one of those responses is particularly skillful, because it fails to respond to the moment itself. It fails to be present for the situation in that moment, and to set down the preconception, set down the wishing it to be otherwise. So it reminds me of the koan. There's a really beautiful koan, and I'm not recalling the teacher. It could be Zhaozhou, could be Joshu. That's the same one, Zhaozhou and Joshu. Zhaozhou is his Chinese name, Joshu is his Japanese pronunciation of his name. And the student says to the teacher, says, what is the teaching of a lifetime? What is the teaching of a lifetime? And the response from the teacher, from the master, is an appropriate response. That's the answer that he gives. An appropriate response. And I really like this koan because it has so many different nuances. So what the student is asking, what is the teaching of a lifetime? One way we might think of that is the student saying, just give me one teaching to work with. I just need one teaching. I'll take care of working with it the rest of my life. Or it could be that the student is saying, what's the highest teaching? What is the teaching that is going to be the most important thing that I receive in this lifetime? Or it could be, and I doubt that this was the intention actually of the student, but it's a way that I tend to think about it these days sometimes, is what is a lifetime teaching you? What is a lifetime teaching you? What is the teaching of a lifetime? So 3 different perspectives, 3 different ways we might think about what the student is asking here. And then the answer. So the reply that comes is an appropriate response. And again, so the highest teaching is an appropriate response to a student's question. That is the highest teaching, to offer the appropriate response in the moment to whatever presents itself. Or you could say that the teaching of a lifetime is an appropriate response, meaning the lifetime is teaching you, the lifetime that you get is an appropriate response to the karmic activity that you set in place. That's what this lifetime is teaching you. It's teaching you these are the results of the karmic activity that you're doing, whether it's in this lifetime or from before. That's what a lifetime is teaching you. Or it could be an appropriate response is the teaching that I'm giving you to work with for your lifetime. So this is your one teaching that you get to study for this whole lifetime. Go, try it out. An appropriate response in every moment from now on, the rest of your life. So when we look at the person who's always late, when that person shows up late, instead of throwing up our hands and saying it's just completely, we're not able to deal with it at all, which is a subtle or perhaps not so subtle form of aversion, or instead of trying to fix it, trying to optimize it, trying to jump in and make something happen and create, solidify our view, justify our case for being angry, let's say, or irritated, or walking away because that person is late. Instead, we could simply approach the situation and without any inner pressure, without any extra view, just ask, wow, Sally, we had an appointment at 7 and we've had this appointment at 7 once a week for the last 5 weeks. And the last 5 weeks you've arrived later than 7. So I'm wondering, what's going on? Can we talk about this? Do we need to set a different time? Approach it without the view. Approach it without the clinging, without the having solidified wanting it to be otherwise. So, and also approaching it from the standpoint of addressing the behavior, not condemning the person, because the person is a set of behaviors that can and will change. If we're honest with ourselves, if we're generous enough with ourselves and with others, we can interact in the world in that way. We touched on this a little bit during our discussion last week. So that's a couple of examples about how to work in the present moment with interdependent arising and with the steps, the two particular steps in the chain, ignorance and craving, that we can impact. We can actually have a direct insight into and response to. And there's a couple of other things that I wanted to touch on from the Thich Nhat Hanh reading this week related to that. So on page 62, Thai tells this story of the Buddha having the conversation with Mara. And Mara saying that it's not going well. And there's no footnote here telling us which sutta this might have come from. In fact, I'm not sure whether it came from a sutta. I think it's a lovely anecdote, however, and the Buddha did. So this is, I think, really very skillful to speak about on page 61, to speak about Mara as the antagonist. Because that's really, I think, the role that we see for Mara when he's described in the Buddhist suttas, the early Buddhist teachings, discourses. Not as a devil, although he says demon here. I wouldn't use the word demon. I don't think of Mara as being a demon necessarily, but as the antagonist, as the one who presents us with difficulty or doubt, or kind of corrosive doubt, or who questions us and our ability to wake up. That's really how we see him. And I think this dialogue that Thai presents between the Buddha and Mara, where Mara says, things are not going well, and I'm really tired of being Mara, and you know, my disciples, my students, they are just totally out of control, and you know, I always have to talk in riddles and look evil, and Mara's complaining about various parts of his life. Does this sound familiar? Mm-hmm. And then the Buddha, Thai says, the Buddha listened attentively and was filled with compassion and finally said in a quiet voice, do you think it's fun being a Buddha? And what I love about this story, what I appreciate about this story is that whether or not this came from the suttas, what we do see in the suttas is that even after so the Buddha tells of a very arduous process for him to awaken. And then we also hear time and time again about his being challenged. His being challenged and reviled is the word that's sometimes used, or abused by people. People trying to trick him. People, as the story says, students, disciples misrepresenting his teaching and his having to correct them. Students not following the lifestyle rules, the Vinaya rules of monasticism that he set down, and creating difficulty in their communities. All sorts of things, difficulties also happened in the Buddha's life. So don't think for a moment that anybody has a life that is so free, any human, let's say, has a life that is so free of suffering that they don't have what it takes to experience the Four Noble Truths. We all have a life that gives us both dukkha and the opportunity to see how to end our entanglement with dukkha. That said, I think we also need to have compassion for many folks whose life is so painful and so difficult that they don't know that they have that capacity, that they can't actually see that that choice is available to them. Spiritual teacher Ram Dass, who I don't know well, but I have heard a few of his teachings, and he gave a very beautiful teaching about trees. And he said, you know, you go to the park or you go to the forest and you see lots of different trees, and the trees have different shapes. And maybe some of them grew up tall, and maybe some of them haven't grown up tall, or maybe some of them are bent, and some of them are straight. Some of them are very leafy, and some of them are not. But when you see the trees, you understand that the trees are that way because of the conditions that were present for them. Because of their proximity to another tree, or the amount of water, or the amount of sun that they got, or the kind of tree that they are, or the seasons that they were exposed to. And we understand that the trees come to be different by virtue of the different causes and conditions that they experienced. And yet when we look at human beings, and we don't remind ourselves that that same thing is true for those human beings. That they are the way that they are because of the causes and conditions, and because they have this fundamental ignorance that we all carry to some degree or another. So we could bring some compassion to the moment. We could bring some compassion to each other by remembering that even the Buddha and even Mara experienced difficulty. And along that line, on page 64, Tai says he makes this beautiful statement: you have to work for the survival of the other side if you want to survive yourself. True in war, true in environmental activism, true in relationship, true in many ways. I think that much of when we talk about bodhisattva practice, or we talk about practice for the benefit of all beings, even in early Buddhism, that is possible by understanding our interconnection, by understanding that what helps another being to be free, to be peaceful and at ease and happy and wise, that also helps me. That also makes for a better world. So despite the messages that we get in Western society about survival being an individual matter, I would say that that's actually how we get ourselves into a lot of trouble. And finally, to just mention one other piece related to our readings this week, which is about signlessness. So this again is related to not getting caught by appearances, not getting entangled with our ideas about the world as desirable or undesirable or permanent rather than impermanent, or separate as rather than not separate. or self as rather than not self. But he touches on this teaching of signlessness. And I just want to say, this is a very technical term, signlessness. And there's a bit of reading about it in the island as well. It wasn't part of our reading for this week, but it is related to the Paticcasamuppada. So I do want to bring it up a little bit. And you can have a look at page 204 of the island. So signlessness is a technical term, and it's difficult to describe except by talking about what things are not. So if we attribute meaning to phenomena, those are signs. So basically all concepts, including concept of self, those things are signs. And any kind of perception, right? Because we talked about perception as one of the khandhas. Perception means identifying a thing. And typically we would do that by attributing a word to it. So signlessness, or animitta, signlessness is a state of mind which is free of conceptual proliferation. And on page 204, this is the latter part of a very long sutta, which is quoted here. The discourse on the shorter discourse on emptiness, I think it is. Yeah. And the Buddha says, a bhikkhu, a practitioner, a bhikkhu means, for those of you who don't know, a bhikkhu means a monk. A bhikkhuni is a nun. Some people translate the word as mendicant so as to be a little bit more gender neutral. And I sometimes use the word practitioner because this capacity is true for lay people as well as ordained folks. So, but at the top of 204, a practitioner attends to the singleness dependent on signless concentration of mind. So a kind of unification, kind of immersion into a concentration that is very still, very free of perception. Totally free of perception would be complete signlessness of mind, or absolute signlessness of mind. Yes, it's possible. Let me just say that right up front. It's possible. And understands thus. So now this understanding isn't happening at the moment of signlessness of mind, right? This understanding is happening as a reflection, as a post-reflection on that. Whatever disturbances there might be dependent on the perception of the base of nothingness, those are not present here. There is present here only this amount of disturbance connected with the 6 sense bases of body and conditioned life. So understanding that even in the stillest of mind, there is still this basis in the 5 khandhas. And so understanding that, then we get down to the second to last paragraph. This signless concentration of mind is conditioned and volitionally produced. Right. So it happens on the basis of certain kinds of conditions that happen in the meditation, and those conditions that are happening in the meditation are intentional. You sit down and do a certain kind of concentration meditation, and it leads to that signlessness. But whatever is conditioned and volitionally produced is impermanent and subject to cessation. So knowing that even that kind of clearness of mind is conditional is to be again released. And then he says, knows and sees, when that practitioner knows and sees thus, their heart is liberated from the grasping for sensual desire and becoming and ignorance. So the way that we see this expressed sometimes in the Mahayana is in the Sandokai, for example. We see even a still and quiet mind is far from it. What is it? The insight. The insight into the nature of reality. So the insight into the nature of reality is the conditionality, knowing that conditionality and volition is what is producing this whole round of existence. And knowing that, then you are no longer pushed and pulled by it. You're no longer dragged around. You're no longer identified with that thing. So, as Tai says on page 76, signlessness doesn't mean that there are no signs. It means that we don't get caught by their appearance. So that is your reflection question for this week. What is it? What is it to truly be willing to accept this world of appearances as exactly that? What would that look like? What would that look like? So I hope to see you all on Tuesday night. Be well.